Hello, global gardeners, and happy Monday. Unless you're somewhere where it's already turned into Tuesday. It's always nice to see everybody on. I haven't seen Rick check in yet, but it's early morning Tuesday for him. And for the rest of us, it's the beginning of a gardening week. I had a good weekend, as some of you have already noticed. My book that released officially on Saturday is already sold out on Amazon and Barnes and Noble online. Hopefully, they'll be replenished soon. I encourage you to check with your local bookstores because I know a big allotment of the books have been sent to bookstores, and also Target and Walmart online. Last time I checked, have the book available. So that's just so exciting. I thought we would talk about raised beds today, partly because some of you have already received the book or are about to receive it, and then others wanted it but couldn't get it. So I'll answer your questions about raised bed gardening, and I'll cover some of the things that I talk about in the book and also some things that aren't in the book because there's just so much about raised bed gardening that even though I wrote over 300 pages about raised bed gardening, we had to cut a lot from the book. So there's so much to talk about. And I want to hear your comments and I want to hear your questions so we make sure that we get it all covered. Raised bed gardening, right off the bat, of course, it's not for everyone. But one of the things that I really like about raised bed gardening is it can bring benefits and advantages for most gardeners who might have a particular problem, an issue, something that's not going right. And by trying a raised bed, you may discover that you are able to have some success in the garden that you weren't able to have before. So that's going to be the focus today. I'll talk about some of my philosophies about raised beds, of course, some very good specific information to help you out with your raised bed gardening. And I want to make sure that we cover as much as possible. So Greg says April 13th delivery for him. Katie says April 29th because Amazon is delayed. Bohemian Herbology says I pre-ordered the second I heard. Such a demand. They didn't have enough to send. Awesome. Thank you so much. And that's one of these things. It's my first book. Maybe the next one we'll have a few of these things figured out ahead of time. But the publisher didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what to expect. And this is just awesome that all of this is happening. Sherry says, I experienced that when I wrote my book. Publishers slap the face and say, nobody will read a long book. Well, yeah, I think when the material is right, then people will read a long book. And it is one of those kind of things that we can all benefit from. So the thing about raised bed gardening that I really want to stress is that you look at my videos, you look at my garden in particular, you look at what I have in the background behind me today, and most of the focus tends to be on the wooden boxes. And so across YouTube in particular, on Instagram, we gardeners who are publishing our videos and our photos have the wooden beds. And that's partly because it's so easy. I show in my book step-by-step guidance on how to cut the boards and screw the boards and stack the boards and make raised beds out of boards. It's so easy. And especially if you're just getting started with raised bed gardening, the wooden box is a great way to go because it is so simple. One of the disadvantages to raised beds, and I think it's important to highlight both the pros and the cons, is that with the wooden raised beds, over time, that wood is going to break down. It's going to decompose. It's going to need replacing. Now, my beds are between 4 and 5 years old, and they're still in great shape. I expect at least another 3 years out of my beds. So for me here in Colorado, having a 5 to 8 year longevity on the wood and potentially longer is another great benefit to starting simple, starting cheaply, and do it with wood. But I recognize that I have many more years left in my gardening journey, and that's why I've begun trying and transitioning to other types of raised beds. So I did videos last year talking about some metal raised beds, my stone raised beds. I've got my videos on how to build the concrete block raised beds. And while you can do that in the beginning, I often encourage gardeners who are just starting with raised beds to start with the wood, because the wood, believe it or not, doesn't have to be as permanent a fixture in your garden. If you put in a raised bed made out of wood and it doesn't work out, you don't like the location, you can unscrew the boards, move the soil, move the boards to a new location, and start all over again. It's not as easy when you build a concrete block or a stone raised bed. So when you have everything figured out and you know the location is perfect, then yes, by all means, go with something that's more permanent, because the stone is not going to break down and the metal is going to last much longer than the wood. The structure and what we build those structures with is important. And because so many people default to the wooden raised beds, I think gardeners can become unhappy with the wooden raised beds. They might not be as pretty. They might not fit with the theme of their garden or with the look of their landscape. That's where stone and steel may come in as an alternative. So something to think about as you're moving forward with your raised bed gardening plans, and something I think can make a difference as you put it all together. Mobius says, I watched the cinder block video. It was great. Thank you for that. Yeah. The key difference is, so when we talk about some of this, I am able to construct my wooden raised beds in less than half an hour. It's 3 boards. You cut one of them in half, you screw them together. And even if you don't have much experience with tools, you can build a wooden raised bed in virtually no time. My concrete block raised bed, even though my video, of course, makes it look like it moves pretty quickly, it took me 3 days to build the concrete block raised bed, because I spent most of the first day preparing the ground, leveling it, getting the spacing right, getting all the measurements right. Then I spent a good part of the day moving the blocks in because they're heavy and I was building a big raised bed, and putting some of them in place. And then the third day was finishing up the bed and putting all the rest of the blocks in, and then beginning to fill it. And it wasn't until the fourth day that everything was filled and ready to go. So those are the trade-offs when we talk about how we construct our raised beds. Now, that being said, I'm never going to have to replace those cinder blocks. Even though I live in Colorado, I get asked this question a lot. I'm in Colorado, I get the snow, I get the ice, I get the freezing soil. The cinder blocks, those concrete blocks, they don't crack, they don't move, they are stationary and they're locked in position. I'm never going to have to replace the components of that bed. You can't say that with the wood. So those are the kind of trade-offs. Do you want easy in the beginning where you can put it together, fill it, and start growing in it? Or do you want to have something that requires a little more planning, a little more prep, more strength, and more time? And the result, though, is once it's done, you don't have to worry about it. Sherry says, I got 2 of the metal Vigo beds ready to go when I get my scrawny self out and can work in the cold. And so that's kind of the in between. So I've got a couple of videos where I show the metal raised beds, and of course I show it in the book as well. And it takes a couple hours to put together one of those metal raised beds. And then depending on the size of the bed, it takes much of a day to fill the raised bed. So I treat those metal raised beds as kind of a 2-day project by the time you build it and then fill it with soil ready for planting. But they're going to last for years and years and years. The Vigo and all the other companies that are making these raised beds have a spray coating, usually on the inside and the outside. So the outside is the color, the inside is kind of the protection, so that the metal is not breaking down when exposed to the moisture and the soil. And so my metal raised beds that I have in my garden, I'm expecting at least 15 or 20 years from those before they start breaking down. In time, they can. My galvanized steel raised beds, that don't have the paint and don't have the coating on them, they're good for 10 years, probably, maybe 15. And depending on your soil, it will determine how long all of these different types of beds last. So my dry Colorado region, where we don't get a lot of rain, and then in the winter, even with the snow, it's relatively dry, my wood is not decomposing very quickly. And my soil is naturally alkaline, but once I add all the organic material to it, it becomes closer to a neutral pH. So the metal, particularly the galvanized steel, is going to last a long time. But if your soil is acidic in particular, if your soil has a low pH, that's going to actually hasten the breakdown of the metal. Galvanized steel will actually break down when exposed to acidic conditions. So that also becomes a factor in deciding what kind of material you're going to use in your beds. And so this last year, when I built my stone raised beds using flagstones, a lot of work, a lot of days of effort, but they're not going to be breaking down in the weather. They're not going to be breaking down based on the soil pH, and they're solid and will be there for many years to come. So just some of the factors when you start thinking about what you have to go through. Mountains and Mayhem says that Tattered Cover didn't have the book. I had to order it, but definitely go there. I love Tattered Cover. Tattered Cover in Denver in particular. We had a Tattered Cover here in Colorado Springs, but it closed down last year. I love Tattered Cover as a bookstore. So the bookstores may not have the book in stock right now, but it may be a quick order, and they may actually be able to get it to, or get the book to you before some of the big sellers that are saying it's going to be April. Thank you for that, Jay. Shout out to Jay and Heidi doing such a fantastic job. I have a playlist on the Gardener's God channel that actually lists all these different videos I'm talking about that show how to make the different beds, how to fill the beds, how to grow in the beds. So you can definitely check out my playlist on the Gardener's God channel to see some of those things. Richard says, we have wood raised beds, been in for almost 10 years. They're starting to rot. We are now slowly transitioning to 30-inch metal and cement block. Will be much easier for my aging mother. So there you go. And I like that. That is a typical transition where you start with the wooden raised beds because they're inexpensive, they're easy to build. And then over time, 10 years is great for wooden raised beds. You recognize how to grow in a raised bed, and you can start transitioning to those that can be more suitable for the gardeners in your family, like your mother in this particular case, or something that won't have to be replaced because of the metal and cement block that can last a long time. Jack says, I use stone in permanent beds for asparagus and strawberries, wood for annual plants. Great suggestion. And this is actually exactly what I talk about in the book. And I show examples of this, that for annual plants, the wooden raised beds are a great choice, because when it comes time to repair or replace the wood, you're not interfering with the plants. And so you can replace the boards in fall, and then by the time spring comes along, everything's in place and ready for the new annual plants. But for those permanent plants, and asparagus is a good choice for this. And I talk about perennials. I talk about bushes and shrubs that are being grown in raised beds. Definitely consider stone for something like that, because once those permanent plants get in place, be it asparagus or rhubarb or currants, you don't want to have to dig up those plants because you're repairing the sides of your beds. You want something more permanent, like the stone or the concrete. And even the metal, while metal lasts a long time, depending on the landscaping, I really like the stone and the concrete block as an option in those permanent beds, the perennial beds, and the fruit and asparagus kind of vegetables. I like that idea a lot, and that really is something that I highly recommend. Rick says raised beds with material to naked raised beds reduces surface area for weeds, hence weeding. So I'm not sure if I read that right, Rick. But yeah, that is another big thing. So when we talk about the advantages of raised beds, when you have these tasks that we have to do, and wooding or weeding, I should say, is one of those tasks that we have to contend with. I think weeding is so much easier in my raised bed garden than in the open ground garden. So when you have an in-ground garden and you've got the pathways that are on the bare soil, and then you've got your furrows or however mounds, however you're growing your plants in the ground, you're going to end up having weeds in that entire area. When you deal with the raised beds, I have the wood chip mulch in the pathways around all my beds. If you can grow grass, having turf grass as the pathways is another great option. Something that covers the ground between the beds that really works to deter weeds coming in. So now all of a sudden, you've cut down on the surface area of how much space is actually available for the weeds to grow. And then within the raised bed itself, the chances of weeds are now limited to that size of bed. And because you can see everything in that confined space, in that dedicated space of a raised bed, when a weed pops up, it's obvious and you can see it right away. I show some pictures in the book of the weeds appearing in the bed, and once you know what your plant is in that bed, if it's not that plant, it's a weed. And then you just, in my case, because I like the wooden raised beds, I just sit on the side and just pluck out those little weeds as soon as they appear and throw in some mulch, and you've got very little weeding that ends up happening in your raised bed. So yeah, definitely an advantage to having the raised beds when it comes to those kind of tasks. For pest control, this is another great reason. So you know that I like to keep my cattle panel hoops in place through most of the season. So the hoops I use, and I do this with my PVC uh, hoops, and I do this with my metal conduit hoops. And I've got videos on all these different types of hoops that I use in the garden. I prefer my cattle panel hoops. I think they're a little easier to work with, but I put them in place. And so early in the season, if I want to increase the soil temperature so that I can plant a little bit earlier in my cold Colorado conditions, I just cover it with plastic. Warms up, I put the seeds in, I put the plants in. I'll keep the plastic in place as needed if the nights are still cold, but then I remove the plastic. And I've occasionally, if I see a pest coming in or if there's a pest that I'm concerned about, once the plastic comes off, I throw row cover fabric or I throw a really thin mesh fabric over it to keep the insects out. So I talk about this occasionally when someone asks about how to deal with pests. Well, if you can create a barrier between the pest and your plants, you don't have to worry about the pest, because the insect pests in particular, and even animal pests, are focused on very specific plants. They don't eat everything, they have their favorites. So if you cover your raised beds to keep those pests out while your plants are small, while they're most vulnerable, then they get a chance to grow big and stocky and healthy. And then you can take that fabric off, that pest barrier fabric off. And the pest is probably already gone because they died out because they didn't find any food or they moved to someplace else. And now your plants can grow very well. Come summertime, I throw shade cloth or hail cloth over my hoops. And so with my raised beds, particularly, and this is a big advantage of the wooden raised beds that tend to be 4 feet wide by 8 feet long, is all of this can be pre-measured. So my hoops are pre-measured to fit the beds. My plastic is pre-measured to fit the hoops. My mesh is pre-measured to fit the hoops. My shade cloth is sized for those hoops. The hail cloth is sized to fit over those hoops. It's easy. I just keep all that stored in the shed. And when I need it, I pull it out and I just throw it on the hoops. So these chores, these things that we have to do to keep our plants alive, I think just becomes so much easier with raised beds because you can make it easier. There's effort, of course, up front, getting everything measured, everything ready to go. But ultimately, it just makes it so easy over the course of the season. Dwayne West says my raised beds are all compost and do very well. However, I did have my soil tested last month, and it's extremely high in potassium, phosphorus, sulfur, and low in nitrogen. And so this is a really good issue to talk about when we talk about raised beds as well. So I, of course, am all about the soil. I'm all about amending the soil. And when you amend the soil, you're getting all that organic material in there. You use a lot of compost, even if compost becomes a majority within your bed that you're growing in, it's going to be packed with nutrients. And I showed this, I think 2 years ago now, where I did a soil test in a raised bed after a couple years of amending, and I had the same issue. I had some very high nutrient levels because all of those nutrients, all that wonderful soil is contained within that nice raised bed space. So at some point, it is okay, and it's actually advised to kind of cut back a little bit because you can get an abundance of nutrients. And some of those nutrients will lock out others. So like too much magnesium in particular, or maybe too much potassium, that can keep some other nutrients like calcium from being able to be absorbed by those plants. And so if you're growing your tomatoes in a raised bed and you get blossom end rot, which is a calcium deficiency disease, most of our soils have plenty of calcium. Adding more calcium is not always the fix. Usually it's a watering issue. But if you're watering correctly and your tomatoes are still not doing well and you add calcium and you still have blossom end rot, it could be because you've got a nutrient overload of other types of nutrients, and it's locking out that calcium from even being absorbed by the tomato plant. So regular testing, particularly when you're focused on getting that good rich soil, it can be important. Now, those other nutrients that are mentioned, particularly when we talk about phosphorus and potassium, the big three of NPK, they're going to be locked in the soil. Once they're in that soil, they pretty much don't move. They stay wherever they are distributed throughout the soil. That's not the case with nitrogen. Nitrogen depletes very quickly. First off, it's going to be sucked up by the plant roots because all the plants are looking for the nitrogen. But when it rains, when the snow melts, when you do a lot of watering, you're going to be washing nitrogen out of your soil. And so that's really what happens when you don't look at the overall, or when you look at the overall picture, assuming that it's all making the soil good, and you miss the particular focus of the nitrogen in particular. So when you do a test and you see that your wonderful rich soil is deficient in nitrogen, it's because often raised beds drain better. That really good soil drains the water. And so our plants are not sitting in a saturated, rotting condition. Well, as the water is draining through the soil, it's taking nitrogen with it. So that is one of those situations where continued amending will add nitrogen, but it could also exacerbate an excess of some of those other nutrients. So using something like blood meal, for instance, a fertilizer, an organic fertilizer that is high in nitrogen, is something that might be of benefit. And some of the other things that also have a nitrogen component, like worm castings, or you make your own fertilizer tea. And so something like a comfrey tea that might have a little higher level of nitrogen. So those are some of the ways to replenish the nitrogen that is naturally washed out of our beds when we're suddenly surprised that we have an abundance of some of those other nutrients, but we don't have the nitrogen in particular. Brent's asking, have you ever worked with a 3D printer for gardening items? I was thinking pots in particular. I haven't. I've been wanting to get a 3D printer for years. It just hasn't worked its way into my budget yet. But I like that idea. I was actually thinking about making game pieces with a 3D printer, but I like that of actually making some pots. So thank you for that suggestion, Brent. I'm not ready to add that to my repertoire this year, but I'm going to put that on the list. You could custom make pots in different colors. Oh, what a great idea. So I'm guessing you've been thinking about that. And so that's an interesting thought. That's a new one for me. Thank you for introducing that thought. We have a library here in Colorado Springs that has a 3D printer, and you can reserve it and do some printing. But a couple times I've looked into it, it's always broken. So yeah, maybe someday I will do the 3D printing of some garden stuff. Great idea. Mobius 981 is asking, what about pressure treated wood for raised beds? Is that usable or is it not a good idea? It's a great idea. It's a great idea. In fact, in my garden, I have done a combination. I've got some beds that are all pressure treated wood. I have some beds that are half pressure treated wood and half untreated wood. And you can actually, especially now that my beds are getting older, you can see the color difference between the pressure treated wood and the untreated wood. And so I haven't released this video. I feel so bad about it because I've been working on it for 2 years now, and I just am not happy with the results whenever I edit it all together. But Oregon State University contacted me a couple of years ago because they were aware of this. I've done videos before where I talk about pressure treated wood being totally safe for the garden. And Oregon State was doing research about pressure treated wood. And so they contacted me, and I took dozens of soil samples from all of my beds and sent them to Oregon State. And so the untreated beds, the treated beds, the combination beds, the steel beds, the concrete block beds, I sent soil samples from all different locations within each of those beds to Oregon State as part of their study. And then last year, they released the results. And the results show that pressure treated wood is fine in the garden. It has no detrimental effects. The pressure treated wood that's being used most places around the world, particularly in the United States, is copper based. Copper is a natural element within our soil. Plants need copper. And so what the study results showed is that there was minimal leaching of some of those copper components from pressure treated wood, but we're talking millimeters from the wood. And the amount of the copper was well below the levels that could be hazardous to plants. And actually, depending on how you want to interpret it, could benefit the plants because you're providing copper to your soil. But because it's so minimal as far as the effect of the soil from the wood, it really doesn't make much difference at all. So yes, I go with Oregon State's findings. I go with my own results, and pressure treated wood is perfectly fine in the garden. And it will actually extend the life of your wood raised beds if you use the pressure treated wood over an untreated wood. The biggest problem I had, and I've got a picture, I don't identify it, but I'll give you all the backstory. So I have a picture in my book of a wooden raised bed that is falling apart, that is in the process of disintegrating. And it was at the Galileo Garden. And so the bed was at about the 6-year-old point when I took the picture of it failing. And I had treated that wood with an organic product. It was a water-based wood preserver that had a copper component in it. So copper is used even in organic wood preservation. And that's why it's not a big deal with the pressure treated wood. But that was the first bed I had that actually began falling apart at the 6-year point. And the organic water-based preservative really didn't have much effect. And if anything, it hastened the breakdown of that wood. So I encourage, and one of the things I talk about in the book is an oil, so like linseed oil. I recommend a natural oil. You could also do mineral oil, something that is not a petrochemical, something that is an organic or naturally occurring type of oil to help your wood last longer. Even if you don't want to try the pressure treated aspect, you should consider doing some type of preservation like an oil-based product to help your wood last longer. You don't have to. It just means that when you use something like that, either the pressure treated wood or an oil-based preservative, you're going to gain probably at least 3 years on the process. So definitely something to think about if you are considering what you're going to be doing with the raised beds and how you're going to anticipate fixing the beds or replacing the beds in the future. So take that under advisement. Sherry says, I love flagstone in any form of masonry. Have some concrete pavers from Lowe's. I'm thinking of mixing with broken tiles for mosaic beds. Hope the butterflies will like them. Laugh out loud. Yeah, I like that look. I'm going to be making some stepping stones following that basic process with the concrete and the broken piles or tiles. So great idea. Yeah, there's all kinds of wonderful things you can do. At one point, at my last house, I had started the process and then was never able to finish it of kind of doing that, putting tiles on the sides of the raised beds to make them pretty. And I'm still thinking about doing that. So I made the cement backer board raised bed this last year. I've got a video on that. And I show the step-by-step process in the book as well. And I'm considering, one of the reasons I went with that backer board was the idea of trying to find some really nice decorative tile and then putting the tile on the outside of the bed to just have a stunning bed. Now, I don't have pictures of that in the book and I haven't done it yet, but that is one of my thoughts as to creating a raised bed design that is just incredible, the kind that becomes a showcase in the garden. And that's one of the great benefits of raised beds is you can do that. You can design and build your raised bed however you want. And if you like those showcase items, if you are able to make it or buy it and you want it, go for it. I think that's a great option to be able to do something in your garden, and the raised beds definitely need help you out with that. Doug says, I need advice on raised beds and sloped property. Thanks. And so if you go back about 6 or 7 years of my videos, and I don't have specific videos where I talk about the raised beds in the slope, but if you look at my garden from 6 and 7 and 8 years ago, I grew on a slope and I grew in raised beds. And the way I did it and the way I continue to do it, though my slope is not as severe, is you cut into the hill. So when you're placing your raised beds, the uphill side is actually half buried and the downhill side is completely exposed. So for instance, if you go back to my videos, you can see how I did it with my raised beds. Most of my raised beds were about 16 or 18 inches tall. And so because of how the slope of my ground where I had my garden, most of those raised beds, they would be an 18-inch bed, but the uphill 15 or 16 inches was buried. The pathway was above the bed. The downside had the bottom, the downhill side had the full 16-inch height of the bed. And so it's like terracing. You're digging into the hill and then you're placing the bed so that it's flat. Raised beds should be flat and level. It's just the backside is buried into the hill. And then you go up to the next level and you do the same thing. So I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I actually had 5 levels within my garden, and there were raised beds on each level. And that's what I did. At the lowest level, and you can see this in some of my videos as well, was concrete block. So the very bottom level had a concrete block wall that was retaining the soil, and then I had the the plants that I grew there, and then above that I had just the wooden box raised beds, and I just dug out the hill, put them in place. I used the soil I dug out to level the pathways and to also help fill some of the beds as I was adding organic matter and everything else. So there you go. That's how I did it. And if you go back to some of those older videos, you can actually see the results of those beds. So for instance, my carrot seed video, my seed tape video, uh, all the terracing of the tomatoes, the planting of the tomatoes, all those videos that are older, you can see that garden, and you can, if you're looking for the slope and the beds, you'll be able to see right away how I did it, and it works. It really works. It's quite effective. Greg says, I had to repair my asparagus bed a couple years ago, and then next year the crop was terrible. Hoping for better results this year. Yeah, that gets back to the idea of the uh, of doing a more permanent bed. Now, my asparagus is in a wooden bed right now. And what I'm thinking of doing, and so this is one of those things that you can do depending on your space to help avoid that problem. Because when you pull the wood and replace it, you're going to be damaging roots, and especially with asparagus. Once it gets established, if you disturb the roots, it's probably going to lead to a bad year the next year. So what I'm planning to do probably next year is I've got the wooden raised bed that I put my asparagus in. I made a video about growing asparagus in a raised bed. I'm going to go ahead and take probably concrete pavers or concrete blocks and ring that wooden raised bed. So I'm going to leave the wooden raised bed in place, and I'll just put the concrete around it. Now, when that wood does eventually decompose, it's just going to add organic matter to the soil. And then eventually the concrete outline will become the new bed. So you could be creative with your raised beds as well by just, instead of replacing the boards, just adding a new outer board or a new outer steel layer or a new outer concrete layer. And that's an option to do. And so yeah, Sherry says, I can't afford enough stone for all the asparagus I need to grow. I have an asparagus problem. But think about that. Stone can be expensive. I will admit my stone raised beds cost more than any other beds I've made because stone is not cheap. But you might be able to do something with metal or with concrete that would also get you that longevity that you'd be looking for. And so, oh, here you go. Yeah, Betty said the same thing that I just was saying. The wood beds in my community gardens were repaired last spring by slapping new boards on the outside of the old ones. The old ones are still there. There you go. Yeah, great idea. And so, particularly for the annuals, or like a vegetable garden and a community garden, that's a very easy approach. I like that. With my asparagus, since I'm anticipating another decade or two that I'll be harvesting the asparagus, that's why I'm trying to think of the concrete or the stone, making it a much more permanent addition. But there you go. Yeah, thanks, Betty. Slapping the wood on, that's a great way to achieve the same effect, and probably much easier and much more affordable. Leanne is saying, first year growing eggplant would be better served with my 8-inch raised bed, my 18-inch birdies bed, or a container. I'm in Ohio, so I'm thinking about the soil warmth. And so the warmth will vary slightly. And so I showed this in a video a few years back, and I did more tests and talk about it in the book as well. Raised beds, depending on the size of the bed, but most of our 4x8 raised beds or bigger are going to have the same temperature as the ground. And so there's not a lot of variation. And it really doesn't matter if it's an 8-inch raised bed or an 18-inch raised bed, the temperature is probably going to be about the same. Containers, however, are going to heat up and cool down much quicker. And so you may see a greater variation. And an eggplant doesn't necessarily like all that variation of cool soil, cool soil, hot soil. And that could be a factor. A raised bed will warm up faster, only by a few days. It's not as pronounced as a lot of people think it is. So a raised bed will warm up faster in spring. But based on my temperatures that I take on a daily basis in the spring, trying to figure this out, it was only about a 3-day advantage, maybe a 4-day advantage. And what I mean by that is, so when I put my eggplant in the ground, I want the soil temperature to be close to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, about 21 degrees Celsius. And so my raised beds reach that temperature a few days before my overall in-ground landscape. And so for the eggplants that like a nice warm soil, depending on how long your growing season is, those couple days might make a difference. And so the 18-inch raised bed is going to warm up a little bit faster than the lower bed, because the lower raised bed is going to be more like the soil temperature. And so for someone like me here in Colorado, where our ground freezes, it stays cold very deep in the soil. It takes a while for the ground to thaw out and warm up. And so even though when I'm measuring these temperatures, the top 8 inches or so of the ground or of a low raised bed has warmed up, it's still cool below that. Whereas if you have an 18-inch raised bed and you're measuring the soil temperature, pretty much all the soil in that bed is going to be about the same temperature. So that's a factor when it comes to your eggplants, as to how early you want to put them in the ground and what kind of growing conditions you want. Now, the eggplants that I've always grown have been in raised beds, and they've done great. And those couple extra days, especially if you can cover the hoops with plastic to make sure the soil is nice and warm, it makes a difference for me here in Colorado because I have such a short growing season. And so I prefer the higher beds with those season extending options for those plants like eggplant and melon and peppers, the ones that really do benefit from a warmer soil. But ultimately, it comes down to how much work you want to do and how you want to manage the plants once they get in the ground. I think you'll probably be very satisfied with an 18-inch birdies bed, but you'll probably also be satisfied with an 8-inch low raised bed. And in Ohio, I'm not sure when your last frost date is. I'm guessing sometime in May, similar to me. But I'm usually not putting my plants in the ground till June, first week in June, because that's how long it takes for the soil to warm up, even after the frost is no longer an issue. So put some of those things into your decision making, and maybe that can help you out. So Det Gror Hosgro, hello to you in Norway. I always love giving a shout out to the new viewers from around the world. So nice to see you here, and thank you for being part of us today. That's so nice. Mountains in Mayhem is saying, I definitely find weeding is much easier in my raised beds. I have in-ground beds and raised beds, and the soil gets much less compacted, so it's easier to get most of the roots. Yep. You can see them easier, and yes, like I said, I sit on the bed and I just pull them out. I never worry about the roots being left behind in my raised beds because the soil is definitely less compact. And that's another advantage to the raised beds is you're not compacting the soil. You're not walking on the beds. Your pets aren't walking on the beds. Hopefully, you're not getting that compaction. And so the roots tend to grow faster and longer to reach all those wonderful nutrients. And it's easier to pull plants out. Even I have a section in the book where I talk about thinning out the plants when you plant and when you put your seeds in and when you transplant. And if you need to get rid of some of your plants along with weeding, it's so much easier if you can just pull them right out of that nice loose soil. So definitely, clearly an advantage in the raised beds versus some of the other beds. Robin Garden says, I went with pea gravel over membrane between my stone raised beds. It's a great way to absorb heat for an earlier start in spring. So I like the idea. I talk about the advantages of heat and gravel in some of my greenhouse videos. That's what I did in my greenhouse. I've got the gravel around my water buckets for that exact reason, to absorb the heat earlier in spring to get the beds warmed up. Great idea. Absolutely great idea. So thank you for sharing that, Robin. I appreciate it, because for those of us that live in cold regions, whatever we can do to get that extra heat can make a big difference. And the stone pathways, especially when it comes to weeds as well. So much easier to deal with weeds when you put a gravel pathway in between. So, but I like that idea of using that to warm up the soils as well, because it every day makes a difference for some of us, and it really can help. It really can. So consider that if you're looking for a mulch. I talk a lot about the wood chip mulch because the wood chip will break down. My overall soil is so bad and my organic content is so low that what I've found, and why my whole landscape is mulched in wood chip mulch for the most part, is because that helps moderate the temperature, helps moderate the soil moisture. But as the earthworms in particular discover my garden, they can crawl throughout that soil because the wood mulch offers some food. It also offers protection. And so between my raised beds, it's not necessarily an earthworm highway, but I will take the earthworms that I dig up from some area outside my vegetable garden, and I'll incorporate some of those earthworms into my raised beds. And so I'll typically start on one side, and I kind of did this as an experiment. My hypothesis was that I was going to have earthworms in all of my beds by doing it, and that's exactly what happened. So I just introduced earthworms to one edge of my garden with the raised beds, and then I had the wood chip mulch in between. Within a year, by the next season, I had earthworms in those other beds. Two additional rows naturally had earthworms, and it's because they do their digging, they're burrowing, they're moving. They will not stay in the same spot, which is why if you buy earthworms and put them in, you can expect that they're going to move to other places. They migrate. And I think the wood chips help that with the migration of the earthworms into better beds. But the gravel doesn't hinder that. And if you already have a fairly good natural soil, the pea gravel or concrete block kind of pathways will work perfectly fine. Gina says, I stopped my blossom end drop by heavily mulching to reduce moisture loss in my dry climate. There you go. Yeah, that's another way to reduce the risk of the nitrogen depletion and also some of those other nutrients getting out of balance, is by using a nice heavy mulch, because almost all of our soils have enough calcium in them. We just need to make sure that there's enough organic matter for the soil life to actually make that calcium available to the plants. And a mulch is an answer to definitely improve the conditions so that the calcium is available to the plants. So another good suggestion, use mulch, and it definitely can make a difference if you're having some issues with some of your plants. So Doug is saying, I love this channel and the depth of Gardner Scott's knowledge along with his passion and his high. Well, thank you for that, Doug. And hello to you. I appreciate that feedback, and I'm so glad that I can help. I love Mondays. I love talking about gardening, and this is a great opportunity to get together with you all and talk about gardening. I did went to an event, a social event this weekend with some gardeners, some non-gardeners, but it's always fun because I think there were 25 of us, give or take a little bit, and the gardeners, like we often do, grouped up and started talking about gardening all night long because we all are in that mode where it's too early to plant, but we want to plant, but we love talking about gardening. So this is a good opportunity to do that, is get everybody together and talk about gardening. Okay, another question. Is there any downside to reusing wood from concrete forms to build beds? I figured it would extend the wood life. Yeah, so that's an interesting thought. So if you are able to use the wood that's used in making whatever the concrete form is. So typically for like a foundation, they might use plywood. For a low wall, they'll usually use boards. And those boards can be reused and become a raised bed. There's minimal concern, and I say minimal because I know some people think it's a big concern. But a question I get asked when I make my own uh, stepping stones, or I make my bird feeders, or whatever I'm doing with concrete, the question is always about leaching and the concern about deadly chemicals are going to be leaching from the concrete. Well, I don't have that concern. And so any of the lime, and that's really what's going to be leaching. So any of the lime that comes from the Portland cement that is adhered to the side of a board is going to increase its longevity. That's impregnated into the wood, and it's definitely going to last longer. There's going to be minimal, like I said, leaching of the possible lime that's impregnated in that wood. But kind of like the copper, the studies I've seen show that it is very close to the wood. So if it leaches, we're talking just a few millimeters along the edge of that board. And think about sidewalks and driveways, all of those major concrete structures. And there are still flowers and grass and plants that are growing right next to them. So the minimal amount that might be in the wood, I think, is really no concern at all. And in the process, especially if you can repurpose that wood, yeah, I say go for it. It'll probably buy you years to be able to add to the longevity of the board. So that's an interesting idea. Now, when we talk about this, Shannon's asking, I've always heard not to use railroad ties, but I can get them for free by the truckload. What are your thoughts? And so railroad ties are kind of in a different category, and they can be hazardous. So some states, like California, for instance, consider the chemicals that are used in the railroad ties carcinogens, cancer-causing agents. And you look at some of the organic growing literature, and railroad ties are not allowed in organic farming for the same reason. It's because of the creosote in particular. And so the creosote impregnated wood allows the railroad ties to last for years and years and years and years without breaking down. But that creosote does leach into the soil more readily, and it has been identified as a carcinogen. So I would be careful about using railroad ties. Now, having said that, I've grown in beds with railroad ties and not had any issues. I've tried to get older railroad ties so that major leaching of the creosote had already happened. And then I put them in my beds, and I'm pretty much of the belief that the creosote, which also hinders not only hinders the decomposition of the wood, but it also deters insect pests that might be eating the wood. So termites and anything else that might be burrowing in the wood, they're not going to be burrowing into the railroad ties. And so it's not necessarily a deterrent to insect pests in the garden, but just be aware that because it acts that way with the insect pests, it's also acting that way with the soil organisms that are near the edge of the bed. So whenever I had a railroad tie bed, I kind of gave myself a 6-inch buffer around the edge of that railroad tie. And I didn't grow any plants there because I just assumed that the soil life was not going to be as healthy. And I wanted the plants to stay within healthy soil. And then there's also the thought that the creosote could damage the plants. So if you're growing in a railroad tie bed, keep the plants a little bit farther away from the creosote side. I actually had written about this, everything I just said, I'd written about in my book. The publisher suggested that we remove it because it's identified as a carcinogen. So you're not going to find anything in my book about railroad tie beds, but I do think they could be used in the garden. I have grown them in the garden. You just need to be aware that while you're handling them, wear gloves. If you cut them, wear a mask and try to minimize the contact with that creosote that's in the wood. And as long as you are aware of those potential problems, then go ahead and you can use them without too much concern. And just look at your plants. If your plants aren't doing well in that bed, then you might want to move them to another bed, amend the soil, let the soil grow for a couple years to get healthy, and then focus on your plants in the middle of the bed. And then maybe that can make a difference. So Aaron was asking a question, so let me clear this up. Was I recommend putting linseed oil on untreated wood or also with pressure treated? And so when I was talking about the linseed oil, I was talking about that as an alternative to pressure treated wood, to use linseed oil on untreated wood. Around here, the wood that we buy at the big box stores is fir. So it would be fir that you would treat with linseed oil to help it last longer. You can put it on the pressure treated wood, but it really isn't as necessary. The idea of an oil treatment like that for preservation is primarily for untreated wood. Okay, so let's see. Sherry says the hardy board backer board will not stand up over time if it's not made for exterior construction. Please look into what's called parging used in even severe climates. Yeah, thank you for that. And so I haven't filled my bed yet, and I am still just leaving it out to the elements, both the inside and the out, as an experiment to just see how long it will last. But I can tell you, after an entire winter, my hardy board backer has held up okay. And so this year I'm going to be putting soil in it, and I'll be measuring the any degradation I have in it. But you are exactly right, which is another reason why I'm thinking about putting the tile and a light coating of either the concrete, kind of like talking about the concrete impregnation of the wood, kind of doing that with like mortar on the inside and or the outside of the hardy board backer to see if that will affect how long it holds up. So thank you for that, Sherry. You're exactly right. I have looked into some of that, which is why it's still kind of an experiment for me. And I'll definitely be reporting back on it. So keep your fingers crossed. Serena says, I pre-ordered the book right after Gardner Scott first talked about it. My roommate said she would pay for it. Awesome. So far, it comes today. Cool. Haven't checked yet to see if it's still coming today. I hope it does. I know that some people have gotten it. I know that, and so for the future, kind of stick this in the back of your brain. Hopefully, I'll have another book coming out in a couple years. We'll see. But everybody I know that pre-ordered it at a bookstore they were available. They were actually at the bookstore on Thursday or Friday to be picked up. And multiple states, people that pre-ordered at a bookstore, the book was actually delivered and ready before the official Saturday release. So that's good to know. I didn't know that when I've ordered books before. But the likelihood of getting it at a bookstore may increase the availability and actually the time that you can get, the time it takes to get the book. So I think that's kind of exciting when it comes to the availability of something that suddenly becomes unavailable to have that problem. Okay, let's see. I know I'm behind with some of my comments, so I'm gonna scroll through and see if I can catch some. If you put the @ Gardner Scott at the beginning, it helps me see whether it's a question to me versus a comment to somebody else. And so I'm more likely to see what you're talking about. Bowtie Life says, "Good morning, global gardeners from Destin, Florida. My raised beds are by far my favorite. They are the showcase around our private sitting area out back." Awesome, David. That's awesome. Yeah, that's the approach I took with my metal raised beds. I talked about that in the video I have about designing with raised beds and using the beds as a focal point. And I've got them around my gazebo for exactly that reason. They add a change in the texture of the garden and the color of the garden, and you can still grow plants in them. So I think that's a great way to go. Sherry says, "My metal beds and the cedar ones already out there are kitchen table height." Ooh, that's a good height. Any ideas for how to reach the stuff that grows up that high? I'm 5'4" and don't walk with stilts. And so when I was growing in the greenhouse at the Galileo Garden, the beds were roughly 20 inches high. And I was growing cucumbers and tomatoes that were 15 feet tall, and I had to use a ladder. And so just a regular folding ladder, but like a 6 foot tall ladder. And I would move it up alongside the bed and climb up the ladder. And that's how I was able to reach the tomatoes and the cucumbers for pruning, for harvesting, for all that kind of stuff. So a ladder. And I, of course, encourage that you have somebody else holding the ladder if you don't want to fall into your bed. But that's about the only way to do it. You can set up a system. So I had set up a system. I wish I would have filmed this and made a video about it. But I was growing hops. And one of the methods for growing hops, because hops will also get 15 feet tall with very little effort, is that you grow them on a trellis and you design the trellis so that the whole thing collapses. And so if you're growing something that allows for a big harvest all at once, then that could be an option. Or you design a trellis that you can actually lower the trellis and you have access to everything. So with the hops, I would just drop the trellis on the ground and then harvest all of the hops and then raise the trellis back up for the next year for the hops to grow up. So those are the two ways I've done it: a collapsible trellis or a ladder. And I'm guessing a ladder may be the easiest option rather than trying to design a whole new trellis system. But they both work. You can also try growing horizontally, where you do some trellising. I do this in my big fenced-in area with the fabric over the top, the hailcloth, and I'll grow my tomatoes more horizontally. And so the actual growing space for those beds, because those are taller beds, those are like 20 and 22-inch high beds, and the whole area is only 6 feet tall. So we're really only talking about 4 feet of space for those tomatoes to grow, and I grow them at an angle. So they don't grow straight up to be 4 feet tall. They grow at an angle to be 7 or 8 feet long. And so there's some horizontal growth on my tomatoes. You can do that as well in the way you trellis, is just do more horizontal so that it's within reach. And that may give you some plants where otherwise you wouldn't do it. Rick says, "Did you enjoy the interview with Charles Dowding on the Urban Gardener on Saturday?" Yeah, it's interesting to hear Charles, and Charles has commented and vice versa a little bit. He's not one of my gardening friends, but when you see some of his videos and read his books, you think that he's different than the rest of us. But when you see him on the show, like he was with Enoch on the Urban Gardener show on Saturday, he's just like the rest of us. He's just a regular guy, just a regular gardener, talking gardening stuff, trying out some new things. And so there was some good discussion about some of the no dig stuff that he does and how he got into it. So I did enjoy it. I wasn't able to watch the whole thing. I had to leave before the end of it, but it was a good interview to see Charles helping out a small channel like that and being willing to talk about gardening. Like I said earlier, most of us just like talking about gardening. So if given the opportunity, we're definitely going to do that. And I think that's a good way to be. Just talk gardening whenever you can. Doug says, my local gardening club stresses protecting the soil and raised beds with cover crops or straw. Yeah, absolutely. So do I. And, I've got my videos on mulching, and I got my videos on cover crops, and it's all done in the raised beds. Bare soil, well, so like, and in the background, this is during the growing season. And in this picture, you can see one bed that has bare soil. Everything else has mulch in it, lots of plants actively growing. And so the only time I have bare soil is right before I'm putting seeds in or putting plants in. And I try to have my soil protected at all times, even during the winter, especially during the summer with the intense UV radiation, with the chance of insect pests burrowing and laying eggs in the soil, with the chance that a heavy rain could wash away the soil. There's just so many reasons to have a mulch or a cover crop. And that's another advantage to raised beds is you don't have to do that throughout your landscape. You can focus within your growing space in your raised bed to protect the soil and keep the soil good for your plants. So I'm glad your gardening club does that, because that is a very good idea. Protect the soil at every opportunity and always have it covered. That's what nature does. And, if you think about it, if you go into a forest, it's not bare soil. It's all covered with the leaves, with the pine needles, whatever type of forest it is. If you look at the prairies are always covered with a grass of some type. Even in the mountains, like here in Colorado, if it's not a bare rock outcropping, there's something growing in that ground. When you get above the frost line, it's a different story. But whenever the soil is capable of supporting life, it's going to support life. That's what nature does. And it's a great idea to do that in the garden as well. Sandy says, yellow bottom leaves on inside young plants, low nitrogen, maybe. So the thing about yellowing of leaves, there are going to be a lot of reasons. So if you are overwatering and drowning your plants, the lower leaves are going to start yellowing. If you are underwatering your plants, you're going to start having some yellowing. The yellowing tends to happen quicker in an overwatering situation than an underwatering situation. The low nitrogen, you will probably see discoloration of the leaves where they start losing their dark green, and you start seeing some of the veininess in the leaves before you see those yellow leaves. So look at the whole plant. If the whole plant looks good, then the water level is probably good. If it's green and healthy, except for those lower leaves, then the nitrogen level is probably good. And so it is normal for plants to lose their lower leaves as the plant grows. And so if you start from seed, those very first two leaves, the cotyledon leaves, are going to turn yellow and fall off because their sole job is just to jumpstart photosynthesis. And once the leaves, the true leaves, start growing, they take over. And so those bottom leaves are going to turn yellow and fall off. As the plant grows, especially with indoor growing, if there's not enough light for the entire plant, for the photosynthesis to develop and for the energy exchange between the roots and the new growth, The upper leaves are probably going to get all or most of the light. And so those lower leaves now are shaded out. They're not getting the light for photosynthesis. So what do? They turn yellow and fall off. So look at the whole plant. It's not an easy answer. And like I just said, there's so many different things that could be causing it. But if the plant looks healthy and the leaves on the bottom are turning yellow and falling off, it's probably not much of a concern. That's typically normal. It's when the top leaves are turning yellow that it becomes a more serious issue. Bottom leaves yellowing, it's okay. And I actually have a picture in my book of some of my leaves turning yellow on the bottom. And I have this same discussion talking about how don't worry about it. If everything else is good, it's okay to just let them either fall off or go ahead and prune them off. Once they start turning yellow, they're not doing their job anymore and they're going to fall off the plant. It's just whether you help them out with that process or not. I'm just Stardust is asking, what's your opinion about having a worm farm? On one hand, I like the idea to be self-sufficient with very potent fertilizer, but on the other hand, the red wigglers are invasive. And so I've got a series of videos where I talk about my red wigglers and I set up a worm farm and I harvest the worm castings. And it works great for me indoors because I can't do it outdoors. And this is the thing about red wigglers that a lot of people don't understand. They have a very small range of temperature that they are able to survive in, and even a smaller range of temperature where they're actually going to be active and eating. And when we talk about a small range of temperature, we're talking summer temperatures that aren't too hot and definitely not too cold. The winter temperatures are going to kill them. So I don't have red wigglers outside of my Colorado garden because it's a waste of time. They will die in winter. They live just within the top couple inches. So many of our native worms, and I've got a video where I talk about the 3 different types of worms and the different levels that they live at. And so like the night crawlers, for instance, the biggest worms we're going to have in our landscape, they'll burrow feet into the soil. And so when winter comes, they don't freeze, they don't die because they're that deep. The red wigglers are a type of worm that live in the top couple inches of the soil. And so when a harsh winter comes and freezes the ground, the worms and the eggs are frozen and they're done for. So a worm farm, I think, is great. Just recognize that there's different types of worms, and the types of worms like red wigglers that you're going to be buying for a worm farm are really intended for a protected space, an indoor space. And so a lot of the commercial worm farms are doing indoor worm farming if they're using a worm like red wiggler, because it just won't survive. There are some others that are a little hardier, like some of the European worms that are used in vermicomposting. But still, even then, having them in a shed or a barn where it doesn't get severely cold really makes a big difference. So I say go for it. Having a worm farm is easy. For me, the worms eat kitchen scraps, the stuff that's left over in the kitchen. And I talk about that in those videos, how I feed the worms with just my kitchen waste. And so it's an easy way to get some really good nutrition for your soil by having the worms. But they're, for most of us, they're not going to be that invasive. And so take a look at your conditions. Now, if you live in a region where it's summertime all year round, if you're in some of those areas of Southern California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Florida, then yes, they could potentially be invasive, and you might want to go with an alternative. But if you have a real winter, then the red wigglers shouldn't be an issue because they can't handle those temperature variations, and they're just not going to survive well if they're exposed to those kind of variations. So Let's see. Bowtie Life says, I've always understood concrete to be a stable and inert material when it comes to gardening. Yes, less leaching than rusting metal, and certainly less than the minimal leaching of treated. Yeah, and that's why I say look at your sidewalks and look at your driveways, and the plants are still growing. Once it's cured, the concrete isn't going anywhere. It's only in those conditions where you might have a light layer like on a wood, or if it's not fully cured, that you might have minimal leaching. But I agree with you. It's not a concern, and nothing I'm concerned about with my gardening. And I talk about that when people ask me about my concrete blocks that I used in the beds. Same thing. The blocks, if they're fresh and they're powdery and there's some lime on them, yeah, that lime might find its way to the soil, but no, the actual block itself, it's not going to be an issue. It's one of those kind of things that I'm not concerned about, and I really don't think it really should be much of a concern. Uh, okay, let's see. Laura's saying, I have pieces of a 30-year-old fence we had to take down last year. Do you think it's safe to use some of it to build my compost bins? Yeah, I would think so. In 30 years, that wood has been exposed to so much solar radiation and so much weather that anything that might have been in that wood, if it had been treated with something, no doubt has been leached and isn't there anymore. So if the wood is still in good enough shape to repurpose in a compost bin, I say go for it. And the bacteria that's decomposing the material in your compost bin is really not going to be affected by old wood that has 30 years of age on it. So unless there's some other kind of treatment that they've been receiving on a regular basis, I really don't think it would be anything to be concerned about. And it's a good way to repurpose wood in the landscape. Silly Lily, good to see you here today. You are my go-to gardener. I get so much useful information on gardening. You're the best, Scott. Well, thank you for that. And I've been seeing you around on some of the other shows, so I'm glad that you're getting around and also participating in some of the other live streams that are out there. So nice to have you here, and so glad that I can be part of your gardening world. And that's one of those things that it's so nice to see different people in different areas, and it kind of gives us all a good idea of those of you that really do benefit us as well with your viewership. So thank you. Sherry says, RE the harvesting from up high, need to find a 6'7" boyfriend. Okay. Yeah, LOL on that for sure. The height definitely makes a difference. And I talk in my how to top tomato plants video that's a reason to actually prune the tops of your plants. So if you don't want to get out on a ladder and you don't have the tall boyfriend, then you might want to just prune your plants so that you keep them within reachable distance. A plant, particularly an indeterminate tomato, is going to want to grow and grow and grow. But if you prune it, you can manage it and keep it growing to whatever the height is that you are looking for. So keep that in mind. You do have control over your plants by pruning them. Karen at A Garden for All Seasons says, training tomatoes over taller hoops between beds, like a tunnel, might help. Oh, I like that idea. You could adjust to your height. Maybe the fruit would pull down and be easier to pick. Oh, there you go. Same idea, where you are pruning your tomatoes or training your tomatoes at a good height. And so I've got my cattle panel hoops between two tall beds. Absolutely. I use mine more for flowering vines, but you could easily do cucumbers and tomatoes and squashes and anything that would be growing up and could be trained to a hoop. And easy picking. Keep it at a good height. So you've got control over your plants. Just never forget that. You can control your plants. And that's one of those things that you can manage your garden to fit the way you want it to work for you. Kathy says, I see the sunflowers in the background. Are they in raised beds or in the ground? So the sunflowers I allow to grow in the ground. So my vegetable garden in particular, my fruit garden with the bushes. So all of my currants and aronia and honeyberry, all of those are growing in raised beds. And my asparagus and rhubarb are growing in raised beds. But outside the raised beds, I allow other plants to grow to encourage the pollinators and the predatory insects and all of the beneficial insects. And the sunflowers do that. So I just allow the sunflowers to grow all around my landscape outside the raised beds. And they've kind of naturalized to my landscape. So I leave them up into the winter so the birds have a food source. And then by the time spring comes and I'm cleaning everything up, those seeds are scattered everywhere and they pop up every year now because I just let them grow. If they pop up in my raised beds where I'm growing something else, it's a weed. It's a plant I don't want in that bed. So even though I love my sunflowers, I will treat them as a weed in the beds that I'm growing tomatoes and peppers and squash and everything else. So outside the beds, I let a lot of that stuff go, and a lot of that stuff naturalize, especially if it's a beautiful plant like sunflowers that has a lot of benefits. So think about that. Too often we are so focused on our gardens looking pretty, and only the plants we put in place are the ones we allow to grow. But if you think outside that box and allow other plants to grow, it really makes a difference. And so like rabbits, for instance, I've got rabbits all over my landscape. Not as many in the backyard because the dogs do a pretty good job of keeping them under control. But the raised beds are a deterrence for the rabbits. So I've never had rabbits eat anything that are in my raised beds. One of the reasons for that is the height. They have to jump up and now expose themselves to hawks and the owls that are in my area, and they're not going to do that. But also because I have the grasses, the native plants, what others might think of as weeds that are growing outside my garden beds. And that's what the rabbits eat. So I let the rabbits roam through my garden eating the weeds. Keeps the rabbit happy. It keeps my weeds a little bit under control. And I don't have to worry about them ever getting into my beds. So another benefit to raised beds. Also, need to make sure that I mention this. All of my raised beds do have a metal barrier at the bottom. It's like a metal fabric, hardware cloth is what we call it here in the States. So at the bottom of the beds, I do have a metal barrier because I've got gophers and I don't want gophers digging into my beds. So between the height of the bed for rabbits and the metal barrier at the bottom for the gophers, I don't have the animal pests getting into my bed. I do have deer and occasionally will come and munch. And so that's why I keep the hoops on the beds, because it deters the deer. They don't put their snout through the hoops. And during the key season, when there's always two bucks that like to jump the fence and come into my garden, I'll put something like shade cloth over the beds to help keep the deer away from my plants as well. So the hoops on raised beds can be so beneficial to keeping some of those things out and really being able to have control over your garden so that the plants are growing and everything is working out pretty well. Joy of the Garden and Home is asking, how do you keep the dogs out of the raised beds? And so I talked about this. I actually did a video when I first got Mala 4 years ago, I think, about how I keep the dogs out of the bed. It's training. It's having them out in the garden with me. And so almost every video I make, you can see my dogs running in the background. And they're running around the beds or they're walking around the beds. And that's the first part of it, is just training them to stay out of the beds and to walk in the pathways. Now, the puppy, Lika, that I just got this last year, there was that training where I was out with her and Mala, and we would walk around the beds, and everything was fine. She loves being outside. I can't be outside all the time. And so it became an issue a few times where I would look out and she would be standing in a bed, and a few times she would be digging in a bed. That's where the hoops come in. And so I put my cattle panel hoops over the beds. That helps, but particularly when she was about 4 months old and had a lot of energy, she would jump in one end of the hoop and then run through to the other end. And some of my plants were damaged. So I did have to create a barrier, just like I'm creating a barrier for other pests. And I had to put chicken wire on the ends of my hoops to keep her from doing that. And then with just the training, the walking, the being in the garden, if I saw her put her paws up on the edge of the bed, I corrected her to get off, and it hasn't been a problem in at least this winter. And I am going, just to help out the process, I am going to be putting up a fence around my vegetable garden beds just to ensure that her excitement doesn't cause problems. And it's not just her. I'm actually babysitting two of her sisters. So my daughter has two of the dogs from the same litter, and the three of them running through my backyard is just a bundle of craziness. And they're not thinking about the beds, and they're running wherever they run. So because I will be doing more babysitting for the puppies, I'm going to put a fence around it. And so that's how I do it. Initially, the training, Mala never gets into the beds ever anymore because she's learned not to. Lika the puppy is in the process of having more consistency, but the best answer is just to keep them out, either with hoops and chicken wire or with a fence around it. There's only so much you can do to keep your animals under control, even if they're exceptionally well trained. If they're not within your sight, and they're Lily, my lovely yellow lab that was such a wonderful garden dog, if she would be chasing something and that something ran across a bed, she would run across a bed in the chasing of it. So I have had dogs in gardens in the past that would be chasing a squirrel, and the squirrel would run across the bed and the dog would run across the bed. If you have those kind of issues, you got to put up a fence or some other type of barrier to keep them out. And that's just one of those things you just have to be aware of. So Nan Shadley, a new member to the Gardener Scott community. Welcome. Great to have you here, and thank you for joining the community. I appreciate that. Bohemian Herbology Natural Solutions says, I learned that in Africa, they can't even share seed between villages. So many imaginary boundaries. Exactly why seed abundance and sharing amongst others is so vital. I'm not aware of that, but yeah, gardeners should share seed. If you've got seed, share it. I talked in one of the live streams I was on recently about seeds and garden clubs. And every month, we meet monthly in my garden club, and every month we have people bringing seeds. We have an official seed saving time, like September, October, end of season, and usually the beginning of the season, like March, April, people will bring seeds. But for gardeners who have a lot of seeds, they're bringing their seeds every single month. And I think that's awesome. That's a great way to share with others, because you never know if you're going to miss a meeting. I'm going to be missing my next garden club meeting. And you got to take advantage of people that have seeds when they have seeds. And if you're that person with the seeds, share them. Definitely do that. It's one of those things that the gardening community is stronger if we can share our seeds, our knowledge, our time, our enthusiasm. That's all such an important part of gardening that I encourage that you participate in it as well, along those same kind of lines. So if you didn't hear it at the beginning, if you joined us late, I want to thank everyone who pre-ordered or has since ordered my book, Gardener Scott's Guide to Raised Bed Gardening, that came out this weekend. It's sold out. I saw a comment that apparently it's sold out at Walmart now. So sold out at Amazon, sold out at Barnes and Noble, sold out at Walmart online. There should still be availability at other online booksellers, but you might have better success if you go to your local bookshop and order from them. I've asked some questions of my publisher to find out how the distribution works, but as I understand it, they've got different allotments for different sellers. And so my guess is that the allotments for the bookstores are probably still enough that if you were to go to your bookstore this week and order the book, that you would probably have it a few days later. So if you're looking for it and don't want to wait for the month or more that Amazon is saying it might take, and now some of the others, go to your bookstore and check it out, or go to your library and ask them to get a copy so that it's always on the shelf. I think those are a couple ways that you might be able to get good access to it. Next week on the show, I'm going to have some giveaways. So definitely want to see you back like always. But next week, I'm going to have some giveaways, and one of them will be my book. At least one of them will be my book. So hope to see you here next week for some of those giveaways that I'll be talking about. In addition to answering your questions and talking gardening, the giveaways will just be part of it. But you heard it here first. Next Monday, free stuff on the Gardener Scott channel. What could be better than that? So great to have you here. Always wonderful. Monday, the time just flies when we start talking about all the gardening stuff. And it's so nice to see you all here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for buying my book. Thank you for all the support. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Some of us are going to have a blizzard with inches and inches of snow. I hope those of you that still have good weather and can get outside and do some gardening, that you do exactly that. And of course, always enjoy the gardening. I'll see you next week.